Look at this building. Chicago, 1873. Official records say it was constructed in 6 months by workers with horses and wooden scaffolding. But when modern engineers analyzed the same blueprints, they calculated it would take 3 years minimum with today's technology. Now look at this photograph from San Francisco, 1876, then Melbourne, 1880, then Paris, St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires. All built within impossibly short time frames, all featuring identical architectural elements that supposedly emerged independently across continents, all demolished within decades and replaced with simpler structures. Someone photographed everyday life in these cities. The images show something unexpected. Free public fountains running continuously, street lamps that required no fuel, buildings with elaborate ventilation systems when modern HVAC wouldn't exist for another 50 years. And if you examine the basement levels of surviving structures, you'll notice something disturbing. The first floors are buried underground, doors that open into dirt, windows below street level, as if the entire world was covered by several meters of mud in a single generation. I spent 2 years tracking down original city plans, patent records, and photographic archives that most historical databases don't index. What I found doesn't match the timeline we were taught, and the deeper you look, the less the official story holds together. This isn't about believing alternative theories. It's about examining primary sources and asking why certain patterns remain unexplained. In the next 40 minutes, I'll walk you through 7 specific observations that challenge conventional historical narratives. No speculation, no jumping to conclusions, just documented evidence and the questions it raises. Because whether you accept the standard explanation or consider alternatives, these contradictions deserve answers. Let's start with what these cities actually looked like when people lived in them. The Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago on May 1, 1893. Official records state that construction began in 1891, giving workers approximately 2 years to build what was effectively a complete city. The White City, as it became known, covered 630 acres. It featured over 200 buildings, many of them massive exhibition halls with interior spaces larger than modern aircraft hangars. There were canals, electric streetcars, a working elevated railway, and infrastructure for 200,000 visitors per day. The chief architect, Daniel Burnham, oversaw this project with a budget of roughly $28 million in modern currency. If you break down the timeline, construction teams would need to complete the equivalent of 1 major building every 3 days, while simultaneously installing miles of electrical systems, plumbing, roads, and landscaping. The workforce size listed in documents, approximately 10,000 laborers. No heavy machinery, no concrete mixers, no power tools as we understand them today. When you examine photographs from the exposition, certain details stand out. The buildings aren't temporary wooden structures painted white, despite what some sources claim.
The images show stone facades with detailed sculptural work, multi-story structures with elaborate cornices, columns, and decorative elements that would require months of skilled labor per building. Yet the entire complex allegedly went up in 24 months. Here's where the observation becomes more complex. After the exposition closed in October 1893, the official decision was to demolish everything, not repurpose, not preserve, not convert into permanent civic buildings, demolish. Within 3 years, almost every structure was torn down. A 630-acre architectural complex, representing what was supposedly a massive construction achievement, was erased. Similar patterns appear across other world fairs of that era. The 1889 Paris Exposition created entire districts along the Seine. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis built 1,400 structures covering 1,200 acres. Construction time, 3 years. Demolition followed the same pattern, nearly complete erasure. But if you search for pre-exposition maps of these locations, something unusual emerges. City planning documents from 1870 show building footprints already existing where fair structures would later appear. Property records reference addresses in areas that supposedly didn't have development until the expositions. Survey maps mark water and electrical infrastructure in zones that official histories claim were empty fields before construction began. Take the Palace of Fine Arts from the 1893 Chicago Fair. Photographs show a massive Beaux Arts building with full classical detailing. Now examine insurance maps from 1885, 8 years before the exposition. The same building footprint appears on multiple independent surveys, not planned, not proposed, already mapped as existing structure. This isn't a single anomaly. Researchers going through municipal archives have found similar discrepancies in dozens of cities. Building permits that reference structures before their supposed construction dates, tax assessments on properties that shouldn't exist yet, repair orders for infrastructure that hasn't allegedly been built. The standard explanation is administrative error or misdated documents, but when you find the same pattern in archives from different countries, different languages, different record-keeping systems, the probability of synchronized clerical mistakes drops significantly. Now consider the demolition question. If a city spends the equivalent of hundreds of millions in modern currency to construct these elaborate buildings, even temporarily, basic economic logic suggests reuse. Convert exhibition halls into factories, warehouses, civic centers, reclaim building materials. Yet the documented approach was systematic destruction. Fire damage is cited in many cases, but photographic evidence shows controlled demolition, not fire ruins. And the speed of removal matches the speed of construction, impossibly fast. One photographer, Charles Dudley Arnold, documented the Chicago Exposition from before ground was broken until after demolition. His archive contains 1,400 images.
When you examine them sequentially, the timeline compresses in strange ways. Early construction photos show buildings that appear weathered, not newly built. Demolition photos show archaeological excavation techniques, careful exposure of foundations, systematic documentation, not typical wrecking procedures. Arnold's notes mention something peculiar. He refers to uncovering buildings in several captions, not constructing or erecting. The language suggests excavation rather than construction. His images show workers removing earth from around structures, revealing lower levels. In one frame, you can clearly see a basement window fully intact with glass, buried under approximately 3 meters of soil. This brings us to a pattern that appears in cities worldwide: buried first floors. If you walk through the older sections of Seattle, you can take official underground tours. The city explains this as the result of regrading projects after the 1889 fire. Streets were raised, leaving original storefronts below ground. The same explanation appears in Edinburgh, where Mary King's Close shows entire streets buried beneath newer construction. In Rome, it's attributed to accumulated debris over millennia. Savannah, Georgia has similar underground structures, explained as flood prevention engineering. But examine the timeline. These buried levels appear in cities across different continents, different climates, different geological conditions, all within roughly the same 50-year period in the mid to late 19th century. Official explanations vary by location: fire, flood prevention, urban planning, natural accumulation, yet the result is identical: functional buildings with their ground floors underground, windows looking into earth, doorways that open to walls of compacted soil. When I started noticing this pattern, I expected to find extensive documentation of the regrading or backfilling projects. Moving millions of cubic meters of earth through city centers should generate massive paper trails, work orders, labor contracts, equipment rentals, material sourcing, timeline schedules. In Seattle, which openly acknowledges raising street levels, you can find such documentation. But in dozens of other cities with similar buried structures, the administrative record goes silent. There's no conspiracy required to explain missing documents. Acronyms burn, records get lost, bureaucracies fail to preserve paperwork. What's notable isn't absence alone, but pattern. Cities that meticulously documented minor infrastructure repairs somehow lack comprehensive records for projects that would reshape their entire street grids. I've been tracking down these architectural anomalies across different archives for over 2 years now, and each new document raises more questions than answers. If you're curious about these patterns and want to see where this investigation leads next, because there's a specific event from 1812 that might connect all these observations, the subscribe button is right there. I release new findings every week, and trust me, what we uncover about everyday technology in these buried buildings is going to challenge everything. But first, we need to understand what life actually looked like in these structures when they were in use. The question isn't whether these buildings existed. We have thousands of photographs proving they did. The question is, who built them? When were they actually constructed? And why does the official timeline create so many contradictions? There's a photograph from the 1889 Paris Exposition that deserves closer attention. It shows the Palace of Electricity at night fully illuminated. Thousands of incandescent bulbs outline the building's architecture, creating what observers described as a cathedral of light. The image is dated June 18, 1889. Thomas Edison's first commercial power station wouldn't begin operation until 1882, just 7 years earlier. The Pearl Street station powered approximately 85 customers in a 16-block area of Manhattan. Now consider the scale difference. The Paris Exposition covered 237 acres with over 60,000 electric lights operating simultaneously. The power requirements would exceed anything existing infrastructure could provide, yet contemporary accounts describe the system as remarkably stable, with few outages or dimming issues that would plague electrical systems for decades afterward. When you search for documentation of the power generation system used, the trail becomes sparse. Official sources mention generators installed specifically for the exposition, but engineering specifications for those generators appear in very few archives. Patent records from that period show electrical generation technology that was experimental at best. The reliable high-output dynamos needed for such installations wouldn't become standard until the early 1900s. So what powered the Paris lights in 1889? Some researchers point to architectural elements that appear consistently across these exposition buildings and older civic structures: large metallic domes, ornate spire work, decorative finials that seem impractical for mere aesthetics. If you examine technical drawings from the 1800s, many of these elements are hollow, containing unusual internal wire configurations. Official explanations describe them as lightning rod systems or structural reinforcement, but the placement doesn't always match those functions. Take the dome of the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, one of the few exposition buildings that wasn't demolished. The structure contains an elaborate system of copper channeling that runs through the dome and connects to underground conduits. When electrical engineers examined it in the 1970s during earthquake retrofitting, they noted the configuration resembled an antenna array, though they had no explanation for why such a design would be incorporated into a building from 1915. Similar systems appear in older buildings across multiple continents, often in structures built before conventional electrical generation existed. The Capitol building in Washington, D.C., completed in 1663, has extensive copper networks running through its dome structure. Official records describe this as grounding for lightning protection, but the installation is far more complex than necessary for that purpose. The wire gauge, the junction patterns, the connection to water systems, it all suggests a different primary function, with lightning protection as a secondary benefit.
Then there's the question of interior climate control. Victorian-era buildings, particularly larger civic structures, featured sophisticated ventilation systems that official history attributes to natural convection and careful architectural design. And that's partially true. But when you examine the ductwork in surviving buildings from that period, certain elements don't align with passive systems. The main reading room of the Library of Congress, completed in 1897, maintains a stable temperature year-round through a system that combines natural ventilation with what documents describe as thermally regulated air circulation. The building contains elaborate ductwork, dampers, and air chambers that suggest active temperature management. The official explanation, an early form of HVAC using coal-fired boilers and natural convection. But the boiler capacity documented in construction records seems insufficient for the building's volume, and the duct placement doesn't match standard convection patterns. More puzzling is what you find in buildings that predate the industrial HVAC era by decades. The Royal Albert Hall in London, opened in 1871, features a ventilation system that contemporary engineers described as remarkably effective for temperature stability. The design includes underground chambers connected to the main hall through vertical shafts. Airflow patterns documented in original surveys show characteristics that shouldn't occur through natural convection alone. Temperature differentials aren't significant enough to drive the circulation rates observers recorded. Some alternative researchers propose these buildings utilized atmospheric electrical phenomena, what they term etheric energy or atmospheric electricity. The theory suggests the metallic domes and spire systems weren't decorative but functional, capturing ambient electrical charge from the atmosphere and using it for power generation and environmental control. Before dismissing this as pseudoscience, consider what mainstream science knew about atmospheric electricity in the 1800s. Benjamin Franklin's experiments proved atmospheric electrical potential. Nikola Tesla demonstrated wireless power transmission in the 1890s. Patents from that era include numerous designs for atmospheric electrical collectors and etheric force generators. These weren't fringe concepts, they appeared in serious scientific journals and patent offices. The question isn't whether atmospheric electricity exists. It does, measurably. The question is whether it could be harnessed at useful scales with 19th century technology. Mainstream science says no, the energy density is too low. But then how do you explain documented lighting systems operating at scales that shouldn't be possible with the recorded power infrastructure? Water systems present another puzzle. Many municipal water networks in major cities date their origins to the mid-1800s. Standard history describes this as the beginning of modern plumbing, pumps, reservoirs, pipe systems bringing water from distant sources. But when you examine the pipe diameter, materials, and pressure calculations in original engineering documents, some numbers don't add up.
The Croton Aqueduct brought water to New York City starting in 1842. The system delivered approximately 90 million gallons daily to a city of 300,000 people. That's 300 gallons per person per day, 3 times what modern water systems provide. The infrastructure required for that capacity, with 1840s technology, should be much larger than what construction records indicate. Then there's pressure. Getting water to upper floors of tall buildings requires significant pumping power, yet numerous buildings from the 1860s and 70s had running water on 5th, 6th, even 7th floors, using systems that documentation describes as gravity-fed from rooftop cisterns. The cisterns were filled by municipal pressure, which supposedly came from elevated reservoirs. But calculate the elevation difference between reservoir and rooftop cistern, factor in pipe friction and distance, and the pressure shouldn't be sufficient, not with the pipe materials and diameters recorded. Some buildings had what contemporary accounts called artesian systems, water that rose to upper floors without pumping. Official explanations reference natural aquifer pressure, but geographic surveys don't show artesian conditions in many locations where these systems operated. Either the surveys are incomplete, or something else was pressurizing those water systems. Heating presents similar questions. Radiator systems became common in the late 1800s, using coal or wood-fired boilers to heat water or create steam. You can trace the evolution of this technology through patent records and manufacturer catalogs. But some buildings had heating systems before the technology supposedly existed. The Houses of Parliament in London, rebuilt after an 1834 fire, included what documents call thermal regulation systems in its 1840s design. The architect, Charles Barry, described a system using caloric distribution through regulated air channels. Contemporary observers noted the building maintained comfortable temperatures throughout winter without the smoke and coal dust typical of heating systems from that era.
When renovations exposed the original systems in the 1960s, engineers found hollow wall cavities with terracotta channeling, copper pipe networks, and air circulation patterns that didn't match any known 1840s technology. The system was too sophisticated to be simple ducting, too different from later radiator installations to be early steam heat. The renovation team documented it, then removed it from modern HVAC. Those documentation photos remain in parliamentary archives, showing a technology we still don't fully understand. But the real mystery isn't the technology itself. It's why this level of infrastructure existed in an era we're told was just beginning to industrialize. Because if you look at how people actually lived in these cities, the picture becomes even stranger. There's a census record from 1864 that doesn't receive much attention. The city of Philadelphia conducted a detailed household survey that year, documenting not just population, but daily living conditions. What stands out isn't what you'd expect from Civil War-era America. Over 60% of households reported having continuous water access, 73% had artificial lighting available, and 41% noted climate regulation systems in their residences. These numbers seem impossibly high for the 1860s. Standard historical narratives describe this period as one where most Americans lived in rural areas without running water or electricity, where indoor plumbing was a luxury of the wealthy. Yet here's a mid-sized city reporting infrastructure penetration rates that wouldn't become standard until the 1920s. The survey included occupation data. Something strange appears in the employment statistics. Approximately 32% of working-age adults listed occupations categorized as arts, sciences, and letters. Another 18% were in education. Just 26% worked in manufacturing or industrial trades. The remaining percentage covered service professions, civic administration, and agriculture. Compare those numbers to census data from 1900, 40 years later, when you'd expect more economic development. In 1900, manufacturing and industrial occupations represented 48% of the workforce. Arts, sciences, and education had dropped to 19%. The era had inverted. The later period, which we consider more advanced, actually shows a population with less time for intellectual and creative pursuits. This pattern appears in European records as well. Paris census data from 1870 shows similar occupational distributions, high percentages in arts and sciences, relatively low percentages in industrial labor. By 1900, that too had shifted toward manufacturing dominance. One explanation, the 1864 categories were different, capturing employment types that later surveys would classify differently. Possible, but the occupational descriptions are quite specific. Natural philosopher, mechanical theorist, astronomical observer, botanical researcher. These aren't generic labels that could apply to industrial workers. Another possibility, the economy was genuinely different. If energy and basic resources were more accessible, fewer people would need to work in extraction and manufacturing, freeing them for other pursuits. But that requires explaining where the accessible energy and resources came from in an era we're told was resource-constrained and labor-intensive. Personal accounts from the period provide interesting details. A diary from 1867, kept by a Philadelphia schoolteacher named Margaret Whitmore, describes daily routines that sound strangely modern. She mentions timed lighting in her apartment that activated at dusk, regulated temperature that remained constant regardless of outside weather, and subscription library access that let her borrow books from a central repository delivered to her building weekly.
Whitmore wasn't wealthy. Her salary records show she earned about $800 annually, roughly average for teachers at that time. Yet her living conditions included amenities that standard history claims weren't available to middle-class Americans for another 60 years. Her diary mentions something else. The cost of living was remarkably low. She records monthly expenses in detail. Rent, $3, food, approximately $7, clothing, $2, utilities, $0, she notes municipal services included with residency, transportation, $1 for unlimited access to street railways. Her total monthly expenses, $13, against a monthly income of approximately $67. That's less than 20% of income on basic living costs. Modern Americans typically spend 60 to 70% of income on housing, food, and transportation. Even accounting for different consumption patterns and standards, Whitmore's expense ratio suggests either deflation to an impossible degree or fundamentally different resource economics. Tax records from that period support low living costs. Property tax rates in major cities averaged between 1 and 2% of assessed value. Income taxes didn't exist at the federal level. Sales taxes were minimal and localized. A household earning average wages would pay perhaps 5% of income in total taxation. Contemporary letters and journals frequently mention something curious: people working reduced hours. A factory supervisor's log from 1873 Pittsburgh notes that standard shifts were 6 hours, with workers typically employed 4 days weekly. The log explains this was because production targets are easily met with current efficiency, and extended schedules result in material surplus beyond market absorption capacity. In other words, they could make everything they needed in 24 hours per week, so why work more? Health records from the period show patterns that conflict with our understanding of 19th century medicine. Life expectancy statistics from the 1800s are typically cited as low, around 45 years, but those numbers are skewed by high infant mortality. If you look at mortality data for adults who survived to age 20, average lifespan extended considerably. Some municipal health records from the 1860s show median lifespans for adults of 75 to 80 years, not dramatically different from modern rates. More intriguing are the causes of death recorded. You see the expected infectious diseases, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, but infectious disease mortality rates in some cities appear lower than expected. An 1868 health report from Boston notes that during a regional cholera outbreak, infection rates in the city remained notably suppressed compared to surrounding townships. The report attributes this to superior sanitation and public health infrastructure, but doesn't detail what that infrastructure was. Medical journals in the period reference therapeutic techniques that sound unusual. Electrotherapeutic treatment, magnetic restoration, frequency harmonization. These terms appear in serious medical literature alongside conventional pharmaceutical and surgical approaches. Some were certainly quackery, but patent records show medical devices from that era using electrical resonance, magnetic field generation, and frequency-specific applications that wouldn't re-enter mainstream medicine until nearly a century later. A patent from 1876 describes a device for restoration of vital frequencies through sympathetic electrical resonance. The inventor, a physician named Harrison Crane, claimed it could accelerate healing and treat chronic conditions by realigning the body's natural electrical patterns. The patent includes detailed technical specifications, coil configurations, frequency ranges, treatment protocols. It's not vague mysticism, it's engineering documentation. Did these devices work? Medical journals from the period report varying results. Some practitioners claimed remarkable success, others saw no benefit. That's not unusual for experimental medical technology. What's notable is how quickly these approaches disappeared from mainstream practice. By the early 1900s, most electrical and frequency-based therapies were dismissed as pseudoscience, and the patents were abandoned. Cultural accounts suggest different attitudes toward work and leisure. An 1875 editorial in the New York Tribune discusses the emerging challenge of abundant leisure time and debates how citizens should productively occupy hours not required for labor. The concern isn't unemployment, it's what to do with free time when basic needs are met with minimal work. Theater attendance records, library circulation numbers, scientific society memberships all show high participation rates relative to population. The American Philosophical Society had over 3,000 active members in 1870. The Boston Library Society circulated approximately 5 books per household annually. Concert halls in major cities operated at near capacity most evenings.
These statistics suggest a population engaged in intellectual and cultural activities at rates we typically associate with affluent modern societies, not industrializing 19th century America. But if life was genuinely this accessible, this comfortable, this intellectually rich, what changed? Because when you examine records from just a few decades later, that world is gone. And the transition point centers around a specific period that official histories gloss over, the 1810s. Military records from 1812 are surprisingly scarce for what's supposed to be a well-documented conflict. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain generated battles, troop movements, supply chains, diplomatic correspondence, exactly the kind of events that leave extensive paper trails. And those records exist, but they're fragmentary in ways that don't match other conflicts from the same era. The Revolutionary War, fought 30 years earlier with more primitive record-keeping systems, has more complete documentation. The Mexican-American War, 3 decades later, generated comprehensive archives.
But 1812 sits in a gap. Unit rosters are incomplete. Battle reports contradict each other. Supply requisitions reference equipment and materials that don't match standard military inventory of the period. One particular document stands out. A letter from August 1812, written by a British naval officer stationed near Halifax, describes atmospheric disturbances of unusual severity that damaged ships in harbor. He notes the weather had been normal when vibrations commenced from beneath, followed by rapid water recession and return. That's a textbook description of seismic activity and a tsunami, except Halifax isn't in a seismically active zone, and there's no other documentation of an earthquake in that region during 1812. But when you search geological records and personal accounts from 1812 across different continents, a pattern emerges. A diary from a farmer in Saxony dated June 1812 mentions the ground shaking for many minutes, followed by strange lights in the sky and rainfall of unusual density and composition. He notes that fields were covered in a layer of fine mud after the rain, despite no significant soil erosion in the area. A merchant's log from Calcutta, September 1812, records unprecedented flooding that appeared without warning, covering streets to depths of several feet within hours. The merchant notes this occurred during dry season with no rainfall, and the water carried sediment unlike local river deposits. Parish records from a village near Madrid, October 1812, document earthquake tremors felt throughout the region, followed by days of darkness from atmospheric dust. The priest notes crops buried under ash-like substance, though no volcanic activity was recorded in Spain. These accounts come from different continents, different climates, different record-keeping traditions, yet they describe similar phenomena: seismic events, unusual atmospheric conditions, sudden flooding, deposits of sediment or mud covering existing terrain. Mainstream geology doesn't record a global catastrophic event in 1812. Regional earthquakes, yes. Normal weather variations, certainly, but nothing synchronized across continents. So either these accounts are exaggerated, misinterpreted local events, or something happened that didn't make it into consolidated scientific records. Then there's the timeline of city development immediately after 1812. Urban growth statistics show an unusual pattern in the 1810s and 20s. Multiple cities report sudden population increases that don't correlate with records from immigration or birth rates. New York City's population supposedly jumped from 96,000 in 1810 to 123,000 in 1820, a 28% increase. But immigration records from that period show far fewer arrivals than needed to account for the growth, and birth rates don't explain it either. The standard explanation, record-keeping was poor, census counts were inaccurate. Plausible, except the same pattern appears across different cities with different record-keeping systems. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston all show similar growth anomalies in the 1810s.
More curious is what happened to the new arrivals. Housing construction records from that period don't show enough building activity to accommodate the population increases. Yet contemporary accounts don't describe housing shortages or overcrowding crises. People were somewhere, living in something, but the construction documentation doesn't match the population numbers. Unless they were living in buildings that already existed. There's a category of archival documents called orphan census records, lists of children in municipal care. These records exist for most major cities, tracking children without identified parents or guardians who entered civic institutions. The numbers are usually small, a few dozen per city per year, reflecting normal rates of parental death and abandonment. But look at orphan census records from 1815 to 1825. New York City processed over 11,000 orphaned children through municipal systems in that decade. Philadelphia, 8,000. Boston, 6,000. These aren't cumulative numbers. These are single-decade intakes, representing sudden influxes of parentless children at rates 10 to 15 times normal. Official explanations cite disease epidemics, economic hardship, displacement from the War of 1812. Disease records from that period do show elevated mortality, particularly 1812 to 1815. But the death rates, while higher than normal, don't approach pandemic levels that would orphan tens of thousands of children in just a few cities. And the war's direct casualties were relatively limited, approximately 15,000 American military deaths over 3 years of conflict. That doesn't account for the civilian death rates needed to orphan children in such numbers. Economic records don't support widespread hardship either. Trade data shows disruption during the war years, but recovery by 1815. Crop yields were normal, no major famines are recorded. The economy doesn't explain mass orphaning. What's more puzzling is what happened to these orphaned children. Institutional records show they were processed through civic systems, registered, documented, assigned to orphanages or foster families. But the long-term tracking trails off. By 1830, most of these children had disappeared from official records. Not died, that would generate death certificates, not adopted in ways that created legal documentation, just no longer tracked. Some researchers suggest a different interpretation. They propose the orphans weren't children who lost parents to death, but children who lost connection to parents during a chaotic event, displacement, separation, memory disruption. Under this theory, the surge represents family units broken apart by catastrophe, with children unable to identify their origins. That would require a catastrophe severe enough to displace hundreds of thousands of people and disrupt family structures across multiple cities. Yet this doesn't dominate historical records. Either it's not documented, or it's documented but interpreted differently.
Geological surveys from the mid-1800s provide another piece. When cities began systematic underground utility installation in the 1850s and 60s, excavation crews consistently reported something unusual: layers of compressed sediment separating older foundations from current ground level. A survey report from Chicago, 1868, notes that excavation for water mains revealed a distinct sediment layer of approximately 8 to 12 feet thickness overlaying earlier structural foundations. The report describes the sediment as fine particulate matter consistent with flood or debris flow deposits, but expresses puzzlement because no flood event of sufficient magnitude to create such deposits appears in regional historical records. Similar observations come from excavations in St. Louis, Boston, Philadelphia, and multiple European cities. Sediment layers appearing between older construction and 19th century ground level, suggesting deposition events that aren't explained in historical or geological records. Dendrochronology, tree ring analysis, shows something odd in the 1810s. Trees that survived from that period displayed disrupted growth patterns in their 1812 to 1815 rings. The disruptions aren't localized to one region. They appear in samples from North America, Europe, and Asia. Trees show stress markers, compressed rings indicating poor growing conditions synchronized across continents.
One explanation, volcanic activity. Major eruptions can create global climate disruption that shows in tree rings. Mount Tambora erupted in 1815, causing the Year Without Summer in 1816. That event is well documented and explains tree ring patterns from 1815 onward. But the stress markers begin in 1812, 3 years before Tambora. Something else was affecting global growing conditions before the volcanic eruption. What could cause synchronized environmental stress across continents, leave sediment deposits over existing cities, orphan tens of thousands of children, and disrupt social systems enough to create gaps in records, yet remain poorly documented in official histories? Some researchers propose a series of natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, atmospheric events occurring in rapid succession. Others suggest a single catastrophic event that mainstream geology doesn't recognize. Both groups point to the same evidence, they just disagree on interpretation. The question isn't whether something happened in the 1810s. The environmental and demographic data clearly indicate disruption. The question is, what happened next? Because when you examine how societies responded to the aftermath, patterns emerge that suggest intentional reorganization. And that's where historical narratives start to fracture even more. In 1823, the American Sunday School Union launched a national initiative to establish Sunday schools across the United States. Within 12 years, the organization reported operating over 8,000 schools, with enrollment exceeding 400,000 children. The stated goal was religious education, teaching Bible literacy to children in rural and urban areas alike. But examine the curriculum documents from these schools. Yes, there's religious content, but there's also standardized instruction in reading, arithmetic, geography, and history. The history portion is particularly detailed: timelines of civilizations, accounts of European settlement, narratives of American founding. This wasn't supplementary education, it was comprehensive schooling using religious infrastructure. Why does this matter? Because public education systems in most American states didn't formalize until the 1840s and 50s. Before that, education was local, varied, and inconsistent. Yet here's a national network providing standardized historical education to hundreds of thousands of children starting in the 1820s. And the historical content being taught doesn't entirely match earlier educational materials. Textbooks from the late 1700s and early 1800s show different historical emphasis. They focus on classical civilizations, European monarchies, and philosophical traditions. American content is minimal, some coverage of colonial period and revolution, but not the comprehensive national narrative that appears in 1820s materials. The shift is notable. Earlier texts treated American history as a minor chapter in broader world events. 1820s materials reframe it as the central narrative, with European history positioned as prelude to American development. It's not just expanded coverage, it's recontextualized emphasis. Compare this to European education in the same period. German states, France, Britain, all experienced similar educational standardization in the 1820s and 30s, and all introduced more codified national historical narratives. Prussia formalized its education system in 1819. France reorganized under the Bourbon Restoration with standardized curricula by 1824. Britain expanded its school system through church-based networks in the 1820s. These developments happened independently, driven by different political systems and cultural contexts, yet the timing clusters around the same decade, all producing standardized historical education where it hadn't existed before. One interpretation: this was natural evolution as societies industrialized and needed literate workforces. Education historians generally support this view. The timing makes sense. Post-Napoleonic Europe needed reconstruction. American states were consolidating national identity. Standardized education served those goals. But consider what standardization does. It creates consensus on what happened, when it happened, and how to interpret it.
Earlier education, being decentralized and varied, allowed multiple historical perspectives to coexist. Standardization narrows that plurality towards single accepted narratives. Library holdings from the period show another interesting pattern.
Major libraries, the Library of Congress, British Library, Bibliothèque Nationale, all underwent significant reorganization in the 1820s and 30s. Catalogs were restructured, collections were reclassified, and acquisition priorities shifted. On the surface, this seems like routine institutional development, but examine what was removed versus what was acquired. The Library of Congress experienced a fire in 1814 that destroyed much of its collection. Rebuilding provided opportunity to completely restructure holdings. Thomas Jefferson's personal library became the foundation. 6,500 volumes covering sciences, philosophy, and history according to Jefferson's classification system. But Jefferson's collection represented one person's perspective on what knowledge mattered. The rebuilt library essentially encoded that perspective as institutional standard. The British Library underwent similar reorganization after acquiring King George III's library in 1823. The acquisition brought 65,000 volumes, but integration required reclassifying the entire collection. The system adopted became the reference standard for British academic libraries. Again, institutional reorganization created standardized knowledge frameworks. What was removed in these reorganizations? Deaccession records from libraries are often incomplete, but what survives shows patterns. Materials classified as redundant, superseded, or of questionable provenance were removed. Without detailed item lists, we can't know exactly what that included, but the categories suggest materials that contradicted emerging standard narratives might be classified as questionable. This isn't necessarily conspiracy. Libraries have limited space, acquisitions require prioritization, and institutional reorganization is normal. But the cumulative effect of multiple major libraries standardizing collections in the same period is the narrowing of available historical sources towards consensus views. Then there are the world fairs, which take on different meaning in this context. We discussed the fairs earlier as architectural anomalies, but consider their timing and stated purpose. The first major international exposition was London's Great Exhibition in 1851, then Paris in 1855, London again in 1862, Paris in 1867, Vienna in 1873, Philadelphia in 1876, and so on. These events occurred every few years through the late 1800s. Official purposes: showcase industrial progress, promote international trade, demonstrate technological advancement, and they did serve those functions, but they also did something else. They created collective memory of progress from primitive to modern. The exhibitions were structured as narratives. Visitors would enter through historical sections showing primitive technologies and early civilizations, then progress through chronological developments culminating in contemporary industrial marvels. The spatial layout reinforced a linear progress story, from there to here, from crude to refined, from ancient to modern. This narrative structure appears consistently across different fairs in different countries. It wasn't just showing products, it was teaching historical interpretation.
Millions of visitors processed through these spaces, experiencing a curated historical narrative that reinforced specific timelines and development sequences. The exhibitions also displayed artifacts from ancient civilizations. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome. These cultures were presented as distant historical curiosities, firmly separated from the modern world by vast time periods. Visitors saw Egyptian artifacts labeled as 3,000 years old, Mesopotamian pieces as 5,000 years old, positioned in exhibits that emphasized their remoteness. But examine the provenance documentation for some of these artifacts. Many were recent archaeological acquisitions, dated through methods that were still being developed.
carbon dating didn't exist yet. Pottery typology, stratigraphy, and comparative linguistics were emerging disciplines. Yet dates presented at exhibitions were specific and confident. This tablet is from 2800 BCE. That statue is from 1500 BCE. Those dates became embedded in public consciousness through exhibition displays. When archaeological methods later revised some dates, the earlier exhibition timelines persisted in popular understanding. The fairs created historical consensus before the evidence fully supported it. And when the fairs ended, the buildings were destroyed, eliminating the physical evidence. We've covered the demolition pattern. Now consider why that might matter beyond architecture. If these structures were actually remnants of earlier civilizations, as some researchers propose, demolition eliminates evidence that could challenge standardized timelines. If they were genuinely new construction, demolition is wasteful but not suspicious. The question hinges on which interpretation you accept. Official history says they were temporary exhibition buildings constructed quickly and demolished because they were always intended as temporary. Alternative interpretations say they were pre-existing structures repurposed for exhibitions, then demolished to erase evidence of their actual origins. Both interpretations fit the known facts. Photographs show the buildings existed. Documents say they were constructed quickly. Other documents show rapid demolition afterward. The disagreement is about what happened before the photographs and documents, whether construction genuinely occurred or whether the buildings predated official construction timelines. This same ambiguity appears throughout the period. Educational standardization could be natural institutional development or deliberate narrative control. Library reorganization could be routine collection management or selective source suppression. Exhibition timelines could be accurate scientific dating or premature consensus building. The question isn't which interpretation is true. We lack sufficient evidence to definitively prove either. The question is why certain interpretations became standard while alternatives were marginalized. Because that marginalization happened through specific mechanisms: institutions adopting standard narratives, alternative sources being deaccessioned or dismissed, educational systems teaching consensus views, and public exhibitions reinforcing those views through millions of visitor experiences.
But here's what I keep returning to. None of this required coordination. Institutions independently standardizing around similar timelines, libraries independently reorganizing collections, educational systems independently adopting consensus narratives, these could all be parallel developments driven by similar cultural forces in the post-Napoleonic period. Or they could reflect something else. And the way to explore that possibility is to look at what's still visible. Because despite reorganizations and demolitions, physical evidence remains. You just have to know where to look. There's a structure in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, that doesn't receive much attention. Fort George, officially dated to 1796 through 1813. It's a star fort. 6 pointed bastions arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, standard military architecture for that period, according to official histories. The British built it, Americans destroyed it during the War of 1812, and it was reconstructed in the 1930s. Walk the perimeter. The bastion angles are precisely calculated for crossfire coverage, the wall heights create specific sight lines, and the internal structures show sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture. Military historians attribute this to European military engineering traditions, which British officers would have learned and applied. But here's the interesting part. Star forts with nearly identical geometry exist across North America. Fort McHenry in Baltimore, the Castillo de San Marcos in Florida, Fort Ticonderoga in New York, Citadel of Quebec. And they're not just in North America. Similar star forts appear in Southeast Asia, South America, Europe, Africa, across continents, built supposedly independently by different powers who somehow arrived at identical geometric solutions. The standard explanation is convergent design. Different cultures independently developing optimal defensive structures. And that's plausible. Geometric principles are universal.
Different engineers working on similar problems could reach similar solutions, except the forts aren't just similar, they're often dimensionally identical. Bastion angles match within 1 degree. Wall height ratios correspond precisely. Internal corridor layouts mirror each other. Defensive engineering does have optimal solutions, but dimensional precision across different continents suggests either direct copying or shared templates. If it's copying, the technology transfer happened faster and more completely than most historical technologies. If it's shared templates, someone created a standardized design system that different powers adopted without documented coordination. Some star forts have features that challenge their official construction dates. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Fort McHenry revealed foundation structures extending significantly deeper than would be necessary for the documented construction. The fort's official history states it was built starting in 1798, but the foundations suggest earlier construction or reuse of pre-existing structures.
Similar findings come from star forts in other locations. Archaeological surveys find foundations that predate supposed construction dates or construction techniques that don't match documented materials and methods from the claimed period. These anomalies don't prove the forts are older than officially stated, but they do create questions about the completeness of construction records. Then there's the question of architectural styles in civic buildings. Walk through older sections of cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and you'll notice something. Many buildings from supposedly different construction periods share identical architectural elements. Window proportions, door heights, cornice details, column capitals. These features match across buildings allegedly constructed decades apart by different architects. Standard architectural history explains this as style periods. Neoclassical architecture was popular in the early 1800s, so buildings from that era naturally share characteristics. Victorian styles dominated mid to late 1800s, creating another cluster of similarities. The explanation makes sense for general style trends. But examine specific details. There's a building in Philadelphia with window assemblies, frame, glass, muntins, trim, that match identically to assemblies in a building in Charleston, supposedly built 15 years earlier by different contractors. Not similar, identical. Same dimensions, same materials, same construction methods down to nail types and wood joinery. Coincidence is possible. Both contractors could have used the same supplier, same pattern books, same training traditions. But when you find these exact matches across dozens of buildings in different cities, supposedly built across decades, the probability of independent coincidence decreases. An alternative interpretation: the buildings were constructed in a shorter time frame than official records indicate, possibly by the same organizations using standardized systems. Or they predate official construction dates and were documented when administrative systems began tracking them, not when they were actually built. Decorative elements show similar patterns. Many older civic buildings and cathedrals feature elaborate sculptural work, friezes, statues, relief carvings. Official histories attribute these to skilled craftsmen working with traditional stone carving techniques, and certainly we have documentation of stonecarver guilds, apprenticeship systems, and commission records for decorative work. But examine the precision of some carved elements. The Massachusetts State House in Boston has granite columns with fluting, vertical grooves running the height of the columns. Each groove is uniform in depth and width within a millimeter across the column's entire height. Creating that precision with hand tools requires extraordinary skill and time. Now look at columns in the Rhode Island State House, built supposedly by different craftsmen 15 years later. The fluting dimensions match Boston's within measurement tolerance. Then check columns in Hartford's Old State House, built earlier than both. Again, matching dimensions.
One explanation is standardized measurements existed, and skilled craftsmen could replicate them. True, but the consistency we're seeing requires more than skilled replication. It suggests machining or template-based production that wasn't supposed to exist in early 1800s stone carving. Some researchers have examined decorative elements under magnification and found tool marks that don't correspond to hand chisels and mallets. Consistent groove depths, uniform surface textures,
cutting patterns that suggest rotary or reciprocating tools rather than impact tools. This doesn't conclusively prove mechanical fabrication, but it raises questions about construction methods used. Acoustic properties in older buildings present another anomaly. Many cathedrals and concert halls from the 1800s have remarkable sound quality, even distribution, clear articulation, appropriate reverberation times for their size. Acoustic engineers attribute this to careful architectural design, which is partially true. But modern acoustic analyses of these spaces reveal sound characteristics that shouldn't occur through architecture alone. Resonance frequencies that correspond to specific musical notes, amplification patterns that enhance certain frequency ranges, dead zones and hotspots positioned in ways that don't follow from room geometry. The Boston Music Hall, built in 1852, has acoustic properties that modern engineers struggle to replicate. When acoustic consultants analyzed the space in the 1980s, they found the walls contained embedded elements, hollow chambers, angled reflectors, materials with specific absorption characteristics that weren't in the original architectural drawings. The builders incorporated acoustic engineering that wasn't documented and wasn't supposed to be understood until the 20th century. Underground structures in older cities show similar precision and sophistication. Seattle's underground, which we discussed earlier, contains not just buried storefronts, but complete infrastructure systems. Drainage channels with precise gradients for water flow, ventilation shafts positioned for optimal air circulation, structural supports engineered for load distribution, all supposedly built by late 1800s construction crews using basic tools and limited engineering knowledge. Modern civil engineers examining Seattle's underground have noted the system shows design principles, drainage hydraulics, structural mechanics, material science that aligned with 20th century engineering understanding. Either the 1800s engineers were far more sophisticated than credited, or the infrastructure predates the official construction timeline. Paris has extensive underground networks, catacombs, quarries, metro tunnels, and older structures of uncertain origin. Some sections show construction techniques that don't match documented excavation methods from their supposed construction period. Walls with bore marks suggesting mechanical drilling. Tunnels with alignment precision that requires surveying equipment more accurate than officially available when they were allegedly dug.
Rome's underground is even more complex, with layers upon layers representing different construction periods. Archaeologists can generally date layers through material analysis and stylistic features, but some structures defy clear dating. Construction methods that seem too advanced for their attributed period or too primitive for the materials used. These anomalies get classified as transitional or experimental, but they still represent mismatches between official timelines and physical evidence. Map evidence provides another layer of questions. Old maps, particularly those from the 16 and 1700s, sometimes show features that shouldn't exist yet according to standard histories. Cities mapped before their official founding dates, infrastructure shown before documented construction, geographic details that explorers shouldn't have known. The Piri-Reis map from 1513 is a famous example. It shows coastline details with accuracy that shouldn't be possible with navigation technology from that era. Mainstream historians explained it as compilation from earlier sources, which is plausible, but it still means accurate geographic knowledge existed earlier than the official exploration timeline suggests. Similar anomalies appear in other old maps. The Waldseemüller map from 1507 accurately positions the America's Pacific coastline before European expeditions supposedly reached it. The Orontius Phineus map from 1531 shows Antarctica with topographic details that weren't confirmed until 20th century surveys using ground-penetrating radar to see beneath ice. These maps don't prove ancient civilizations had advanced technology, but they do prove geographic knowledge existed before the timelines that official histories support. Either earlier explorations occurred without documentation, or knowledge was transmitted through means we don't fully understand.
The question becomes, how many anomalies can accumulate before the standard explanation requires too many exceptions? Star forts appearing globally with identical designs, buildings sharing precise architectural elements across vast distances and time periods, acoustic engineering embedded in structures before the science officially existed, underground systems showing advanced construction techniques, maps depicting unknown geography. Each anomaly individually has plausible conventional explanations, but cumulatively they form a pattern, and patterns suggest systems, which brings us to the final question: what system could explain all these observations? In 2007, a Wikipedia editor noticed something unusual. Articles about Tartaria, a historical term for Central Asian regions under Mongol influence, were being systematically edited. References to architectural connections were being removed, citations to historical atlases were being minimized, and discussion sections were being flagged for deletion. The editor investigated and found this wasn't random vandalism. The edits came from multiple accounts, all created around the same time, all focused on Tartaria-related content. The editing pattern suggested coordinated effort to reduce visibility of Tartaria in historical discourse.
Wikipedia's policies prohibit coordinated editing campaigns. When the pattern was reported, the accounts were investigated. Some were blocked for violating policies, but the content changes they'd made largely remained. Tartaria articles became shorter, more focused on conventional historical interpretations, with alternative perspectives relegated to disputed status. This matters because Wikipedia influences how information is discovered and understood. Search engines prioritize Wikipedia in results. Educational institutions reference it as a starting point for research. Journalists consult it for background context. When Wikipedia's Tartaria content becomes more restrictive, it affects how millions of people first encounter the topic. You can argue this is appropriate quality control, removing fringe theories from an encyclopedia meant to reflect established knowledge. Wikipedia's neutrality policies do require mainstream consensus for main article content, with alternative views noted separately if notable. By that standard, restricting Tartaria speculation makes sense. But consider what defines established knowledge. It's knowledge that academic institutions have validated through peer review and publication. Those institutions rely on existing historical frameworks, which were largely formalized in the 1800s through the processes we discussed: educational standardization, library reorganization, exhibition narratives. If those frameworks contain gaps or biases, academic consensus based on them perpetuates those issues. This isn't unique to Tartaria. Many historical topics have been reinterpreted as new evidence emerged or old assumptions were challenged. Archaeological discoveries have overturned accepted timelines. Document translation has revealed misunderstandings. Scientific dating methods have corrected earlier estimates. The question is, how does challenging evidence get evaluated? In functioning academic systems, anomalies prompt investigation. New data leads to hypothesis revision. Conflicting sources generate research to resolve contradictions. But that requires anomalies being acknowledged as worth investigating, which requires institutional willingness to question established narratives. Some architectural anomalies are starting to receive mainstream attention, though not under Tartaria framing. Archaeological research into medieval construction techniques has revealed unexpected sophistication. Studies of cathedral building demonstrate engineering knowledge that standard histories hadn't credited to medieval craftsmen. Acoustic analysis of historical concert halls shows intentional sound engineering beyond what architectural records document. Underground infrastructure surveys find construction precision that challenges assumptions about past capabilities. These findings don't prove alternative historical timelines, but they do narrow the gap between primitive past and advanced present that traditional narratives emphasize. As mainstream research acknowledges greater past sophistication, the anomalies that alternative researchers pointed out become less anomalous. The question is whether this represents new discoveries or recognition of evidence that was always available but previously dismissed. If it's recognition, that implies earlier research overlooked or discounted data that didn't fit established frameworks.
And if past research did that, current research might be doing it too with evidence that conflicts with current frameworks. Free energy concepts provide an example.
Mainstream physics considers ambient energy harvesting impossible at useful scales. The energy density is too low, collection efficiency is too poor, thermodynamic limitations prevent it. These are solid scientific arguments based on current understanding. But alternative researchers point to patents from the late 1800s describing atmospheric electricity collectors, etheric force generators, and similar devices. Mainstream science dismisses these patents as based on misunderstandings, inventors who didn't grasp thermodynamics or electromagnetic theory. Yet some patents include functional descriptions and technical specifications suggesting the inventors had empirical results, even if their theoretical explanations were wrong. It's possible to build something that works without understanding why it works. Early pharmacology did this, effective treatments based on incorrect theories about humors and miasmas. The question isn't whether Tesla and others discovered free energy in a way that violates physics. The question is whether they discovered phenomena that mainstream science later dismissed without fully investigating, because the phenomena didn't fit emerging theoretical frameworks. This connects to a broader pattern in how knowledge gets validated. Scientific progress is supposed to follow evidence where it leads, updating theories when new data challenges them. But science is practiced by humans within institutions, and institutions have momentum. Training creates orthodox thinking, funding favors established approaches, publication rewards conformity to accepted frameworks. Careers advance through incremental work that extends existing knowledge, not radical challenges that question foundations. This creates conservative bias, not political conservatism, but epistemic conservatism. New ideas face high bars for acceptance, which is appropriate for maintaining knowledge quality. But it also means genuinely novel observations can be dismissed if they seem to conflict with established understanding. The history of science includes numerous examples of delayed recognition: continental drift rejected for decades before plate tectonics was accepted, ulcer bacteria dismissed before H. pylori research won a Nobel Prize, ball lightning considered folklore until physical mechanisms were identified. In each case, evidence existed earlier but was discounted because it didn't fit existing frameworks. Could something similar apply to historical questions about the 1800s? Evidence that doesn't fit standard narratives exists. We've examined some throughout this investigation. Mainstream historians explained it through conventional mechanisms. Construction records are incomplete, dating methods had uncertainties, institutional changes happened for documented reasons. Alternative researchers interpret the same evidence as indicating different historical realities: advanced earlier civilizations, catastrophic events not in official records, systematic narrative revision. The evidence doesn't definitively prove either interpretation. It's ambiguous, allowing multiple frameworks to explain it.
So, how do we determine which framework is more accurate? Scientific methods suggests testing predictions. If the alternative framework is correct, we should find specific types of evidence: construction techniques in old buildings that shouldn't exist based on official technology timelines, documents in restricted archives that contradict standard histories, physical artifacts from advanced earlier periods. Some of that evidence may exist. Researchers claim to have found unusual construction techniques, suggestive documents, and artifacts with uncertain provenance. But mainstream evaluation finds conventional explanations for each case, or questions the evidence's authenticity. The debate becomes circular. Alternative researchers say evidence exists but is being ignored or suppressed. Mainstream historians say the evidence doesn't meet scholarly standards or has conventional explanations. Both positions are partly right. Evidence exists that raises questions, but none of it conclusively proves alternative timelines over conventional ones. This is the kind of historical uncertainty that deserves ongoing investigation. If you're interested in following how this research develops, because new archive discoveries and analytical techniques continue providing data points, subscribing will keep you updated on future findings. More importantly, the discussion in comments is where different perspectives get tested against each other. That's valuable for refining understanding regardless of which interpretation you favor. What we can say with confidence: the standard historical narrative has gaps and ambiguities. Official timelines contain periods with fragmentary documentation. Construction records don't always match architectural evidence. Institutional changes in the 1800s did standardize historical education and knowledge organization, which inevitably shaped how we understand the past. Whether those gaps and changes reflect normal historical limitations or something more systematic is the open question. It's not a question that can be definitively answered with currently available evidence, but it's a question that highlights how we construct historical knowledge and what assumptions that process embeds. The practical implication: we should hold historical narratives with appropriate uncertainty, recognizing their interpretations of limited evidence, not absolute truth. This applies to conventional histories and alternative theories equally. Both are frameworks for understanding fragmentary data. Neither has complete proof. For everyday life implications, the question is, if past civilizations achieved greater capability than we assume, what knowledge might be recoverable? If the 1800s represented a reset rather than beginning of modernity, what was lost? These aren't just historical curiosities. They potentially affect how we understand current technological development and future possibilities. Free energy research, frequency-based medicine, architectural acoustics, infrastructure design all have contemporary researchers exploring approaches that might connect to older knowledge traditions. Whether those connections are real or imagined, the exploration itself can yield new insights by questioning current assumptions. The Tartaria narrative, regardless of its historical accuracy, serves a function. It prompts questioning of official timelines and consideration of alternative possibilities. That questioning is healthy for knowledge development as long as it's paired with rigorous evaluation of evidence and a willingness to update beliefs based on findings. Which brings us to the final question I want to leave you with, and this is where your perspective really matters. We've walked through architectural anomalies, timeline gaps, institutional standardization, and evidence that supports both conventional and alternative interpretations. None of it is conclusive. All of it is suggestive. What I want to hear from you, and please share this in the comments because this discussion benefits from multiple viewpoints, is this: what would constitute proof? If alternative timelines are correct, what specific evidence should exist that we could verify? If conventional histories are accurate, what evidence should be absent? And regardless of which framework you favor, what questions do we need to answer to move beyond speculation toward verifiable understanding? This isn't rhetorical. The value in exploring these topics isn't arriving at predetermined conclusions. It's developing better methods for evaluating historical evidence and recognizing where our knowledge has genuine gaps versus where we're projecting certainty onto ambiguity. So here's the truth that both conventional historians and alternative researchers should acknowledge. We don't have complete information about the past. We have fragments, documents, artifacts, structures, photographs that we interpret through frameworks. Those frameworks shape what we see as significant and what we dismiss as irrelevant. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed as an advanced civilization. The question is, how do we construct historical knowledge? What assumptions does that process embed? And how can we improve our methods for getting closer to what actually happened? Because that's ultimately what matters. Not defending positions, but understanding reality. And reality is often stranger, more complex, and more ambiguous than any single narrative captures. There's no hidden truth I'm revealing in this video. There's no secret knowledge that explains everything. There's observation, question, context, the same process historians use, just applied with willingness to examine the frameworks themselves rather than assuming they're unquestionable. Where you go from here is your choice. Investigate further, examine primary sources, visit old buildings, and look at construction details yourself. Question both official narratives and alternative theories. Most importantly, develop your own framework for evaluating evidence, rather than accepting anyone's conclusions, mine included, without verification. The past is not settled. History is ongoing investigation, and the biggest question isn't what happened in Tartaria, it's how we figure out what happened anywhere, anytime, when all we have are fragments to work with. What's your framework for making sense of these fragments? Share it below, because that collective investigation, testing ideas against each other, finding evidence others missed, challenging assumptions that don't hold up, that's how we get closer to understanding what actually happened. And whatever actually happened, it's more interesting than simple stories allow.